I worked really hard at making sure that bad people didn't get to hurt good people. And it didn't work. I tried to put him away for as long as possible so he couldn't hurt somebody, and it didn't work. This guy shouldn't be out on the streets in our community. He should be locked up where he can't do harm to other human beings. Evil exists. He's one of them.
He said he had not seen Erica since that day. After we reviewed the body camera footage from the traffic stop, we know that he's lying to us about when he last saw her, but we don't know why he's lying to us. And that's a red flag. There's a reason why he's trying to distance himself from her. I just need to figure out why.
She said they found her body. And I lost it. And all I remember was my dad grabbing me. He was crying. My mom turned and said, I know who did this. The cop, his eyes watered, looks at my mom dead in her eyes and says, we do too. Bowed his head down and walked away.
These two photographs are of Eric Pearson once he was in police custody. And that's how I remember him looking back in 1994 when I first saw him. There's some people that commit murders in a moment of anger, and then there are other types of murders. And his was just horrific. On January 22nd, 1994, Christina Whitaker was murdered. Her body was found behind an abandoned home in Davie, Florida, and she had been beaten beyond recognition in the face. In the Broward State Attorney's Office, the cases were randomly assigned by the state attorney, and this is one of the cases that were assigned to me. When I received the case and I started reviewing the file, what I learned was that in 1985, Eric Pearson was convicted of burglary and attempted murder of a female, where he sliced her hands and tried to slit her throat. He was sentenced to 18 years. Unfortunately, only served 6 of those years, thus enabling him to be out and to commit the crimes against Christina Whitaker. Christina was 17 years old when she was murdered. That bothers me. Her parents cared very, very much about obtaining justice for the death of their daughter. So, on December 2nd of 1995, we had reached, after a lot of discussions with Christina's parents, a plea agreement that Eric Pearson would plead guilty for the murder of their daughter to second-degree murder. He would be sentenced to 40 years Florida State Prison as a violent, habitual felony offender. He got the maximum sentence he could have gotten in the state of Florida. I thought I had put him in prison for all the time that was necessary to make sure he never hurt anybody again. I never thought I'd be hearing his name again.
This was in the summer. And one of the days we went to the pool. We took the kids. I was 7 years older than Erica. Erica was my baby sister. Erica would follow me everywhere, and I would take Erica everywhere with me. She was loud, funny, energetic. It was never a dull moment when she was around at all. I was always worried for Erica, always. Everybody has mistakes, nobody's perfect. But, everybody chooses their road, and some take the right road and some don't. Some take a little U-turn and come back and fix it all up. My mom called and said she hadn't seen or spoken to Erica since the 24th of September. At that time, Erica was staying with my mom, and what I was told from my mother was that Erica left the house Friday to get a pack of cigarettes, and she hadn't returned. And Erica wasn't answering the phone. Erica didn't post anything on social media, and nobody could get a hold of her. First thing that went through my mind was something happened. It didn't seem right. My mom first went down to Sunrise Police Station. They said there's nothing they could do. She's 33 years old, and she could be anywhere. She's an adult. She might be out with friends. She just doesn't want to come home. My mom was losing it. My mom was saying, "This is my daughter. This is not your daughter. Maybe your daughter will do this, but not my daughter." And they did not want to listen.
When I first spoke to Erica's mom, I would say she was a 10 out of 10 as far as, in panic, worried about her daughter. I could tell that she was concerned and she was worried about her daughter. She had a good relationship with her daughter, and she knew it wasn't like Erica to be, gone for a while without reaching out to her. But me as an investigator, I have to take a step back. I can't allow myself to miss other factors and other evidence in the case that I don't want to miss. She's an adult. There's nothing necessarily suspicious. There's a million possibilities. She might have met somebody, romantically, and they could have ran away together. Based on her history, we knew that that was also a possibility, that she wanted to go, went somewhere to use drugs or whatnot. We're checking hospitals. Maybe she got checked in as a patient. Sometimes people have accidents and they don't have ID on them, so they get entered as a John Doe in the hospital, and then maybe she was arrested under a John Doe. She didn't give her any information. But every day that we don't find that she's been either checked into a hospital or placed in a jail, it's starting to indicate that something actually happened to her.
I was living in Maine, and my mom called me and told me, "Erica's pregnant." I was like, "What?" And when I spoke to her, she was like, "Could you believe I'm pregnant?" And I was like, "No, but you're gonna be a mom." She was like, "Yes, I can't wait." Ever since then, she was happy. She was at that point where she wanted to get better. Erica always wanted to recover and do everything for her daughter. That's what always motivated Erica, was her daughter. Over the years, Erica stayed clean, and she was doing good. But I was very proud of her. When I first got to Florida, my dad would cry at night. And he would say, I know my daughter's dead. I could feel it in my heart, he would say. And then he would hit his chest. But my mom still had hope. My mom still believed she was gonna walk through that door. We went out and put flyers all around. So as we're passing out flyers, we started getting screenshots of posts that were being made on Facebook saying, it's me, Erica, leave me alone. I'm a grown woman. I don't have to come home. Just leave me alone. I'm fine. And the next one would be like, how many times do I have to tell you guys I'm a grown woman? Just leave me alone. Everybody else believed it was Erica. But if you knew Erica, you would know right away that's not her. That's somebody else writing this. We had a feeling it was one of Erica's friends from the neighborhood. He's somebody that's not right in the head. And he would come around, and my sister, she would be friends with anybody, you know? But it got to where, like, he was in love, obsessed with my sister. It was upsetting because the way we were feeling at that time, we still didn't know anything. And, you know, everybody's a suspect.
It's possible that it could have been somebody that had to do with a disappearance that's just trying to throw us off the track, delay us finding her or finding them. Using investigative means, we were able to make contact with Facebook, make contact with the internet provider, and we were able to determine that the post was made by one of Erica's childhood friends, who the mother said was mentally unstable. So it's important for us to speak to that person and figure out why they made this account. We immediately went to his residence. We spoke to him, and he was visibly concerned about the police presence in front of his house. And I explained to him why we were there. He apologized for making the fake Facebook account. He didn't give us a reason why he did it. He said that he was sorry and he was trying to find Erica himself because she had been at that house on the day that she disappeared. That was definitely suspicious, but he allowed us to search his house just to make sure she wasn't there. We went in there, we looked around, we didn't see anything suspicious. He said that he had not seen Erica since that day. He did say that she was picked up by a person he described as a white guy in a truck. He had a roommate that we spoke to, and the roommate's story matched his story. So we were able to determine, you know, he was being truthful with us. I asked him to take the Facebook page down. He agreed and he took it down. At that point, we had nothing else to lead us to believe that he had anything to do with her disappearance.
My mom, from the beginning, she kept doing whatever she could, going on social media, calling the people she knew. At some point, my mom heard that Erica was with a Nick in a truck. My mom posted it on Facebook. If anybody knows of this Nick, to please let her know. And then one of Erica's friends showed up at my mom's house and advised my mom, stop posting that Erica was with Nick. That's not his name. And my mom tells Erica's friend, well, how do you know? And he says, well, I seen Erica at the gas station earlier on Friday. And he said she got off the truck to go get cigarettes in the gas station, and I went up to her and I said hi. But when I went up to the truck, I seen a grimy man. He had this grimy look on him. He looked like a sick individual. It didn't seem right to him. So he wanted to get his name. Erica's friend decided to introduce himself to the driver. Says his name, and he says, "What's your name?" He turned and looked at him and said, "My name is Eric Pearson." Why?
When you look at Pearson's criminal history, one of the first things that comes to mind is this guy shouldn't be out on the streets in our community. He should be locked up where he can't do harm to other human beings. When I moved to Florida in '87, people were serving about 24% of whatever term they received. And so it wasn't just Pearson, it was all the prisoners in the state of Florida. The amount of time they would do was solely up to the Department of Corrections. They determined who gets out, when they get out, and what the basis for that release is. Christina's mother was so troubled that Pearson had gotten out and not served his full prison sentence that she wanted to do something to try to bring about a change, a positive change. She was successful, and as a result, in 1995, the constitutional amendment was passed in Florida where prisoners have to serve 85% of their time. Unfortunately, you can't apply a law that wasn't in effect at the time the crime was committed. So therefore, Eric Pearson wasn't subject to that law.
My sister Erica never mentioned Eric Pearson to me at all. Not once. When I Googled his name, first thing that came up was the Sun Sentinel. And I freaked. Eric Pearson had a violent criminal record, attempted murder and murder, real close by where my mom lives. The things that were going through my head were, how did she meet this man? I just didn't understand, like, where did he come from? So I got on social media and searched Eric Pearson on Facebook, and a page came out, and I screenshotted it and I sent it to my mom. My mom ends up going back to where Erica's friend was at, and he says, yes, that's him.
Erica's mom came to the police department. She had information that Erica was last seen with a person that was recently released from prison for murder. Almost a year had gone by since he was released. He was still on probation. I called his probation officer to let her know that he wasn't in any trouble, that I just wanted to speak with him because he was the last person that she was seen with. I was already parked in the parking lot of his complex before I called him. I called him and I said, hey, I just said, how you doing, Eric? My name's Detective Coronado. Do you have a little bit to speak to me about a missing persons case? Eric is missing. I would like for you to come down and speak to me. He's like, oh, you're down here? I'm like, yeah, just come down. First impression of Eric Pearson is he's very tall. He could be intimidating. He has prison-style tattoos, looks strong. He made it known that he didn't want any trouble with law enforcement. He basically told me that he had met her through Facebook while he was in prison. That they had hung out a couple times after his release from prison. On that day, he, went to go hang out with her, drove her to a gas station. I asked him if he was willing to ride with me. I would drive him around and see if we can find, just piece together the route that he took and any places of interest in this case. I told him he wasn't in any trouble. Everything that he's doing is voluntary, and that I would really appreciate him helping me with this. So he agreed. Once he gets into my car, he directs me to Erica's friend's house. He mentioned that before they went to the gas station, they were stopped by the police. They were pulled over because there was an issue with the tag on the truck. And then once we get to the gas station, he directs us to the pump that he parked. And he said, okay, this is where she got off. She said that she was gonna go buy drugs. She walked off. After pumping gas, he said he didn't see her, and then kind of, drove around looking for her in the area, didn't find her, and then went home. And then after that, he never heard from her again. Very friendly, hey, I really appreciate you helping me out, said our goodbyes and went from there. At this point, after what Eric told me, I'm still hopeful that we can find Erica. So we went to the gas station and we spoke to the employees of the gas station who gave us access to the cameras, and we started to review video. We do have video of his truck at the pump, a female that's walking away that appears to match the description of Erica, and she walks out of camera view. We have the video of the truck leaving a couple minutes afterwards. So we're able to confirm that story. So when I got back into the office, I started, looking for body camera footage for the traffic stop, and I was able to find it.
How you doing? I'm sorry, King's Department. Sergeant there because your tag is not a correct temporary tag. Any weapons in the car? No, sir. Shut up. How you guys doing? All right, sir. Am I supposed to say that? Absolutely. I'm sorry? 27.
Oh man, I was going to sit down with you. Where you at?
By the way, I didn't even see you because normally when I see police, I slow down, but whatever y'all
You good?
come back. Okay.
Don't worry about it.
Thank you, sir.
Have a good one.
So the traffic stop was just a normal traffic stop. They checked all his documents. She doesn't seem like she's in any danger. So the primary officer gives him a verbal warning, just tells him to fix the tag, and just lets him go on his way. When we spoke to Eric, he said that he was first stopped by the police and then went to the gas station. but using both the time on both videos, I can determine that he had switched it around. The body camera footage happens after the gas station. He was with her after the gas station. He's lying to us, and that's a red flag. There's a reason why he tried to tell me he last saw her at the gas station. I just need to figure out why.
Once I learned Eric Pearson's background, the criminal record he had, I knew he had something to do with it. It was a gut feeling. So we went out and we put flyers out everywhere. We started in Davie because that's where Eric Pearson lived at. We did the gas stations in Davie, right close by Eric Pearson's house. And we did corner stores. We received a tip that Eric Pearson would go to a bar daily. And we went in there and put flyers all over the bar. About 20 minutes after we put the flyers at the bar, we received a phone call that Eric Pearson had walked in that bar. He seen my sister's pictures everywhere, and he looked at the people that were there and real loud said, because of that, the cops have been on me all day. Turned around, kicked the doors open, and walked out of that bar. And when I received that phone call, that was it. I knew. I did call the detectives and I let them know it was Eric Pearson, that he did something to my sister. We were told to stop putting flyers up. That's messing with their investigation. Stop putting the flyers out and stop doing this and stop doing that. But we were not. My mom was not gonna stop. Why don't you guys go and arrest who did this? My mind was set that he was the one that did something. And I told the cops, well, I hope you guys get him before I do.
During this investigation, the family made their own flyers and they were going to places on their own, which is understandable because they're hurting, they're trying to find their loved one, but in a way that kind of hinders our investigation because he can totally shut off with us if he thinks that we're looking into him in the same manner. So I had to walk a fine line with them to gain his cooperation. When he came to meet with me, he brought his girlfriend to the police department. So I basically told him that the traffic stop was after the gas station and he did not last see her at the gas station because he was within the car. So he starts to backpedal a little bit, says that he doesn't really remember. I'm not hitting him too hard or calling him a liar flat out. I'm trying to gain his cooperation to see if he can, tell me what happened. While me and him were having a conversation in the interview room, detectives approached her girlfriend and had a conversation with her. One of our female detectives struck, a good rapport with his girlfriend, and they exchanged numbers. At this point, he's not under arrest, he's free to go. So he leaves the interview room. Later on that evening, 11 o'clock, the girlfriend actually ended up calling the female detective and told her that she remembered things that were concerning or alarming. So where the girlfriend lived, it was a trailer that was backed up to a canal. She said that Pearson would go back there and would stare at the canal and would make references like, damn, that bitch stinks. She didn't know what he was referring to, she just thought that was odd. And then we ultimately decided to go out there with cadaver dogs to search that area. They were able to get a hit along the canal bank there. And when they looked, there was something that was covered by palm fronds and rocks, like in knee-deep water. So once they were able to remove that, they were able to see what appeared to be a body that was covered in a tarp and a bed sheet and was duct taped together. It was in a really advanced decomposition state for a body being in the water. At that point, she was unrecognizable. But we saw tattoos that matched the tattoos that she had, and the jewelry she was wearing was consistent with the jewelry that the mom told us that she had.
So, October 16th. I was at a point where I just needed to be like by myself. And I went in the room and I laid down, and I remember falling asleep praying. I fell asleep praying, asking God to just please bring her home. And it was like 2:40, maybe 2:45 in the morning. The door swung open and my mom just fell to the floor on her knees. She was yelling and yelling, and she said they found her body. And I remember yelling, "What did you just say to me?" And she's like, "They just left here, Lynette. They found her body." I jumped off the bed and I ran out the front door. And I was yelling at them, "What did you tell my mother? What did you tell my mother?" And all I remember was my dad grabbing me. He was crying. My mom turned and said, "I know who did this." The cop, his eyes watered, looks at my mom dead in her eyes and says, "We do too." Bowed his head down and walked away.
There was no obvious signs of trauma that we can say, okay, this person has been shot or this person has been stabbed due to the advanced stages of decomposition. So even though she was wrapped up by somebody suspiciously, we don't have a cause of death or a manner of death at that time. So we needed to wait for the autopsy, and then we definitely needed to speak to Eric Pearson. I felt that he was very close to telling us what occurred. He was just obviously, scared of the repercussions and stuff like that. But I felt like he wanted to talk and he wanted to tell us his side of the story.
I get to my condo. I was sitting there, just idle talk, and then I listened to her, so I was smoking a cigarette. She's like, "What's up? You want some?" I was like, "All right." So she went and started undressing.
He claims that they began having sex, the condom came off, and that she became enraged when she found out that the condom had come off and they continued to have sex. He was giving us half-truths, in my opinion.
And the bitch punched me. I'm like, what the And she kicked me. Kicked me in the thigh. She kicked me with her leg. And I was like, what's on? She was trying to calm her down, but it exploded. And miraculously, she got a screwdriver in her hand. What the Now the situation to me escalates. I finally get her arm positioned between both arms, and I put the blade, the pointy end, the blade part of it, towards her eye. I get it down in there, and I get it in.
Which eye?
I want to say the left one went in first. When I hit the second one, it was like she made a sound in her coming out of her mouth like a sigh, I sent you to say, and her movement slowed down.
Stabbing a woman on each eye once and then the neck, and then covering her body up with a tarp and putting her in the water. I would say that act is evil itself.
Let me ask you this, and it's important to clarify. You had made a statement with regards to, and correct me if I'm wrong, you have a monster that could come out.
Yes.
Do you feel that monster came out during that fight with her?
Yes.
Okay.
When I read about Eric Pearson, it took the breath out of my lungs. It was like, no way. He's not supposed to be out. I can't believe this happened again. The last time I looked, I believe was in 2005, at his prison website database, and it seemed like he had a whole long time to go. And then out of the blue, I just happened to read the article about the young lady that was killed in Sunrise. I worked really hard at making sure that bad people didn't get to hurt good people. And it didn't work. That's what's frustrating. I tried to put him away for as long as possible so he couldn't hurt somebody, and it didn't work. So that hurts. That hurts me a lot. She'd be devastated if she were alive and knew that Eric Pearson had been released and killed another human being. What's haunting is that he was able to kill again. Eric Pearson is one of those people that should not be out walking around in our communities preying on innocent people. He should be locked up. That's where he belonged, and that's where he needs to be for the rest of his life. Evil exists. He's one of them.
I'm disgusted with the whole justice system. Disgusted. He killed that girl at 17 years old. She was a little girl. 17 years old. Because he was good in jail, so we're gonna let him out. No, that's BS. You have drug dealers in there, non-violent crimes, sitting in their jail 40, 50, 60 years. But this man had attempted murder, and you let him out. He's the monster. He belongs in hell. I don't wish this on anybody at all. This is the worst feeling ever. I feel like my whole heart was ripped out. I don't think I'll ever heal. I'll never be the same. To the day I die, I'll live with a broken heart. That's all. My poor niece. she won't be able to be there for her graduations. Anything. Anything. They put her picture in front of her ashes. I have her own little spot in my house. Erica loved to drink coffee. So at home, I make her coffee and I'll set her a cup of coffee by her picture in her ashes. I want everybody to remember the fun, loving person she was. I just want everybody to know that she had a beautiful soul.
There are places where silence feels heavier than sound. Places where the wind seems to carry names no one dares to say out loud. In the winter of 2000, one quiet Minnesota town became one of those places. The streets were ordinary. The houses looked safe. Children still rode their bicycles beneath pale afternoon skies, neighbors still waved across snow-covered driveways, and every porch light glowed with the comforting promise that nothing truly terrible could happen here. Until one person vanished without leaving behind a single answer. At first, nobody believed it could be anything more than a misunderstanding. Adults disappear sometimes. Plans change. Cars break down. Phones die. Hours pass. Then a day. Then another. People convince themselves that life will eventually return to normal. It never did. Within a week, every conversation in town revolved around one question. Where did they go? Search parties marched across frozen fields before sunrise. Volunteers carried flashlights through abandoned farm buildings. Police helicopters circled dense forests where bare trees clawed at the gray winter sky. Divers lowered themselves into lakes covered by sheets of ice thick enough to swallow sound. Every possible hiding place became another dead end. Nothing. Not a footprint. Not a struggle. Not a single piece of clothing. It was as if the earth itself had opened for one brief moment, taken a human life, and quietly sealed shut again. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some whispered about a stranger passing through town in an unfamiliar pickup truck. Others insisted they had heard screams carried by the wind that evening, but dismissed them as coyotes. A waitress claimed she remembered nervous eyes watching everyone inside a local diner. A truck driver believed he saw someone standing alone beside an isolated county road, just after midnight, before disappearing into darkness, when his headlights swept past. None of the stories matched. Every version contradicted the last. Yet every resident remembered exactly where they had been when they first heard someone was missing. Because deep inside, everyone understood something had changed forever. Investigators worked around the clock. Detectives pinned maps across conference room walls. Red markers highlighted roads, lakes, wooded trails, abandoned properties, and every confirmed sighting from the final 24 hours before the disappearance. Interviews stretched late into the night. Families, co-workers, neighbors, classmates, cashiers, mechanics, delivery drivers, anyone who may have crossed paths with the victim became part of an expanding investigation. Every answer created 3 more questions. The victim had no known enemies. No massive debts. No reason to disappear voluntarily. Friends described someone dependable, predictable, careful. The kind of person who always called if plans changed. The kind of person who never simply vanished. Detectives examined financial records. Nothing unusual. Credit cards untouched. Bank accounts frozen in time. No airline tickets. No hotel reservations. No indication that a new life had been planned somewhere beyond Minnesota's frozen landscape. Then came the first truly disturbing discovery. The victim's vehicle. It was found parked exactly where investigators expected it should never have been. Doors locked. Keys missing. No obvious signs of violence. A thin layer of snow rested peacefully across the windshield, as though the vehicle had become just another forgotten object beneath winter's endless blanket. Inside, everything appeared strangely ordinary. A coffee cup. Receipts. A jacket folded across the passenger seat. Ordinary. Too ordinary. Experienced detectives know chaos often leaves traces. But staged scenes leave something even stranger. Perfection. Forensic teams searched every inch. Fingerprints belonged to the victim. A few belonged to family members. Nothing else. No blood. No broken glass. No evidence of panic. If a crime had happened, someone had erased almost every trace of it. News cameras arrived. Satellite trucks lined quiet streets. Headlines transformed the missing person into the center of statewide attention. Residents who once left doors unlocked suddenly installed stronger locks. Children were no longer allowed to walk home alone. Every unfamiliar face became suspicious. Every unexpected knock at the door sent hearts racing. The investigation expanded beyond county lines. State investigators joined local authorities. The FBI reviewed evidence. Behavioral specialists developed offender profiles based on almost nothing. Someone organized. Someone patient. Someone comfortable taking extraordinary risks. Someone who understood exactly how investigations worked. Someone who may have watched the search from only a few streets away. Perhaps even standing among volunteers pretending to help. That possibility terrified everyone. Because killers sometimes hide in plain sight. Weeks became months. The snow melted. Spring revealed fields investigators had already searched twice beneath the ice. Teams returned with cadaver dogs. Aircraft photographed remote farmland. Hundreds of acres were combed once again. Still nothing. No body. No weapon. No confession. The absence of evidence slowly became the most haunting piece of evidence itself. Then came the anonymous phone call. It lasted less than 30 seconds. The caller never identified themselves. The voice was distorted. Calm. Measured. Almost rehearsed. According to investigators, the caller mentioned one detail that had never been released publicly. Then the line went dead. Despite enormous efforts, the call could not be traced with certainty. For detectives, it changed everything. Someone knew something. Whether that person was the killer, an accomplice, or simply someone desperate to mislead investigators remained impossible to determine. Every lead generated fresh hope. Every lead collapsed into frustration. Psychics claimed visions. Self-proclaimed witnesses emerged from neighboring counties. Convicted criminals offered stories in exchange for reduced sentences. One insisted the victim had been buried beneath an abandoned barn. Another claimed organized crime was involved. A third described a completely different location hundreds of miles away. Search teams dug. Nothing. Each false confession stole valuable time. Each fabricated story deepened the family's suffering. Years slipped quietly past. The investigation slowly transformed from breaking news into a cold case. Boxes of evidence filled storage shelves. Photographs faded. Cassette recordings became digital files. Young officers entering the department learned about the disappearance from aging detectives, whose voices carried equal parts determination and exhaustion. Some refused to retire without solving it. Others admitted privately they feared the truth might never be known. Yet the victim's family never stopped waiting. Every birthday remained incomplete. Every holiday carried an empty chair. Every unexpected phone call sparked impossible hope, before ending in familiar disappointment. People moved away. Businesses closed. Children grew into adults. But no one who had lived through that winter ever forgot the feeling. Because the mystery had woven itself into the town's identity. Visitors asked about local history. Residents answered with lowered voices. You've heard about the disappearance, haven't you? It was always spoken the same way. Not with curiosity. With caution. Then technology began changing criminal investigations across America. DNA science advanced. Digital forensic techniques improved. Evidence once considered useless suddenly became valuable. Old files were reopened across the country. Cases buried beneath decades of dust returned to active investigation. Detectives in Minnesota wondered whether their forgotten mystery might finally yield answers hidden in plain sight all along. Every sealed evidence bag was carefully re-examined. Every photograph scanned using high-resolution technology. Every interview transcript reread from beginning to end. Patterns that once seemed meaningless started drawing quiet attention. Tiny inconsistencies. Contradicting timelines. Statements that changed by only a few minutes. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone could arrest a suspect for. But enough to make experienced investigators uncomfortable. One detective reportedly remarked that lies often become visible only after enough years have passed for people to forget exactly how they first told them. That observation lingered. Because memories fade. But written statements do not. As investigators compared interviews recorded years apart, one familiar name kept resurfacing. Not because the person had obvious motives. Not because they possessed a criminal history. Simply because they appeared almost everywhere. Always nearby. Always cooperative. Always willing to answer questions. Perhaps too willing. Yet there was still no proof. Only instinct. Only fragments. Only the uneasy feeling that somewhere inside thousands of pages of reports, one small detail had been overlooked. The case remained officially unsolved. The town remained haunted. And somewhere beyond public view, sealed inside evidence lockers and aging detective notebooks, the smallest forgotten clue waited with extraordinary patience, as though time itself had been protecting a secret that refused to stay buried forever. The case did not die. It simply changed shape. What began as a missing person investigation had already outgrown its original files, spilling into cabinets, hard drives, and memory. But as years passed, something stranger happened inside the department. The case stopped being treated like an active search, and started being treated like a warning that refused to fade. Every few months, someone would reopen the box. Not officially. Not publicly. Just a detective alone in a quiet room, pulling out photographs that had been handled so many times the edges had softened like old paper currency. They would stare at timelines that almost made sense, interviews that almost aligned, and evidence logs that almost connected, but never quite did. Almost was the word that destroyed everything. Because in this case, almost always led to nowhere. And yet, beneath the layers of time, something was shifting. It started with a re-examination request from a state forensic unit. No headlines. No announcements. Just a routine audit of cold case evidence storage. Hundreds of cases were reviewed across Minnesota that year, most of them expected to yield nothing. But when the technician assigned to the file opened the sealed evidence inventory, something unusual appeared immediately: inconsistencies in labeling. Small ones. Easy to miss. The kind of errors that could have been clerical, harmless, forgotten. Except nothing about this case had ever felt harmless. One evidence bag had been logged twice under different tracking numbers. A second contained chain of custody gaps spanning several hours, hours that no one had ever accounted for. And a third item, a simple fabric sample, had been transferred between departments without a recorded reason in the official archive. It was not proof of anything. But it was disorder inside a case that had always appeared too clean on the surface. And detectives know something important about disorder. It usually means someone, somewhere, tried to control a situation and failed to document the struggle. For the first time in years, the file was pulled back into active review. Not because someone believed they had solved it, but because someone believed they had never truly understood it. The original lead investigator, now older, returned to the records. He had not expected to see the case again. Most detectives in his position eventually accept that some files remain closed forever, not because justice is served, but because time runs out. He spread the photographs across a table like a deck of cards that had never been shuffled correctly. The victim's last known movements. The vehicle recovery scene. The search maps. The interviews. And then something subtle began to stand out. Not a breakthrough. Not a revelation. Just a pattern of presence. One name appeared repeatedly in statements taken from different witnesses, in different places, on different days. Always in the background. Always close enough to be relevant, but never close enough to be suspicious. That alone meant nothing. Until it did. Because investigators began noticing that this same individual's timeline contained something fragile. Gaps that were too convenient, memories that were too consistent, and statements that seemed rehearsed in a way that only becomes visible after enough years of comparison. Still, suspicion is not evidence. And cold cases are built on the difference between what feels true and what can be proven. So the investigation moved carefully, almost reluctantly, back into motion. Witnesses were recontacted. Some had moved. Some had changed names. Some had passed away. But a few remained, older now, voices less certain than they once were. And when asked the same questions again, years later, their answers began to shift in unsettling ways. Not dramatically. Not enough to accuse anyone. But enough to create friction between memory and record. One witness insisted they had seen nothing unusual that night. Then, after being shown their original statement, they paused for a long time before saying they might have been mistaken about the timing. Another corrected a detail about a vehicle description that had never been widely publicized, suggesting they had only assumed it at the time. Each inconsistency was small. But together, they created something heavier than contradiction. They created uncertainty in places that had once felt settled. Meanwhile, forensic teams returned to physical evidence. Modern techniques had changed dramatically since 2000. What once required large samples and limited results could now extract information from microscopic traces. Items previously labeled inconclusive were tested again under updated protocols. Some results came back empty. Others came back complicated. A partial DNA profile emerged from a piece of evidence that had been stored for decades. It was not enough for identification, but it was enough to rule people out. And when investigators began eliminating possibilities, they noticed something troubling. Several individuals who had once been considered peripheral to the case were no longer peripheral at all. They were closer. Too close. But even then, no single piece of evidence reached the threshold required for action. The case was beginning to look like what detectives fear most: a puzzle where every piece exists, but none of them were designed to fit cleanly together. Then came the phone records. Old, forgotten, archived communication logs that had originally been dismissed as irrelevant. At the time, there had been no reason to suspect anything unusual. But now, with modern mapping tools and timeline reconstruction software, analysts overlaid every known movement, every witness statement, and every recovered timestamp. A pattern emerged that no one had seen before. Certain calls clustered around specific time windows. Certain numbers appeared near key investigative milestones. And one number, in particular, appeared more often than expected for someone who had officially played no significant role in the victim's final known hours. It was not a smoking gun. But it was a direction. And in cold cases, direction is often the first sign that the darkness is starting to narrow. Detectives began to feel something they had not felt in years. Not confidence. Not certainty. But motion. As if the case, long frozen in place, had begun to breathe again. And somewhere in that breathing, buried beneath decades of silence, the outline of a truth that had refused to surface for over 20 years was starting to form, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably moving toward the surface. The town, still unaware of what was building behind closed doors, continued to live with the memory of a disappearance it had never learned to explain. But inside the investigation room, the silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. By the time the investigation regained momentum, it no longer felt like a search for a missing person. It felt like something older, heavier, an excavation of time itself, where every layer removed revealed another layer of silence beneath it. The renewed focus brought in analysts who had never worked the original case. That distance mattered. Fresh eyes don't carry the fatigue of years spent chasing dead ends. They don't remember the frustration. They don't inherit the emotional weight. They only see structure, or the absence of it. And in this case, structure was the problem. Because the case file was not messy. It was deceptively clean. Too clean in places where life is usually chaotic. Too organized in areas where panic should have left marks. It was as if someone had carefully erased disorder, not by removing evidence entirely, but by smoothing it just enough to avoid attention. That kind of precision is rare. And when it appears in a missing person case, it becomes its own kind of signal. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline again from scratch, ignoring previous assumptions. They stripped away interpretations and focused only on verified timestamps, physical evidence, and independently confirmed witness statements. The result was uncomfortable. The official timeline, that had been accepted for years, contained gaps that were no longer explainable as simple memory error. One gap, in particular, stood out. A window of approximately 90 minutes on the night of the disappearance where no confirmed sightings existed, no phone activity was recorded, and no physical evidence could anchor movement. In earlier years, this had been treated as normal. People go missing in gaps like that all the time. But now, with layered reconstruction, that gap began to feel less like absence and more like isolation. As if something had been deliberately allowed to happen without interruption. Parallel to this, forensic review teams revisited digital records that had been migrated from older systems. Early 2000s data storage was inconsistent at best. Some records were incomplete, others mislabeled, and many had been archived without modern indexing. But when cross-referenced with updated databases, anomalies began to surface. Not dramatic ones. Subtle ones. A repeated login location that didn't match expected geography. A timestamp discrepancy in a case note upload. A file accessed more times than its relevance justified. Individually, none of these meant anything. Together, they created a faint but persistent outline of attention, someone returning to the case file repeatedly over time, long after the investigation had gone cold. That detail changed the emotional tone inside the department. Because cold cases are supposed to fade from attention. Not attract it. Not repeatedly. Especially not from someone without an obvious investigative role. Detectives quietly began narrowing their focus toward individuals who had maintained proximity to the case over the years, not just physically, but informationally. People who had stayed close to updates, close to interviews, close to procedural developments, even when there was no professional reason to remain engaged. The list was not long. But it didn't need to be. At the same time, forensic linguists re-examined old interview transcripts. They weren't looking for lies in the traditional sense. They were looking for structure in language, patterns in how people describe time, movement, and memory when under pressure. One particular interview stood out. The subject had answered questions consistently in 2000. No contradictions. No obvious signs of deception. At the time, the interview had been filed and forgotten. But when compared with a second voluntary statement given years later, during a routine follow-up, subtle differences emerged. Not in facts, but in framing. Certain events were described with unnecessary detail in one version and vague generality in another. Some timelines were slightly more precise when they didn't need to be, and strangely less precise when clarity would have been expected. It was not enough to suggest guilt. But it was enough to suggest construction. As if the narrative had been carefully rebuilt over time. Meanwhile, a breakthrough of a different kind occurred in the forensic lab. A reprocessed trace sample, originally dismissed as contamination risk, was reanalyzed using newer amplification techniques. The result produced a partial genetic profile. Still incomplete. Still not sufficient for identification. But it narrowed the field significantly when compared against updated regional databases. And more importantly, it excluded several previously considered possibilities. That exclusion changed direction again. Because every time a suspect pool shrinks, the remaining possibilities become sharper, even if still undefined. Inside the investigative unit, discussions became quieter, more controlled. There was less speculation, more verification. Officers stopped talking about what might have happened and started focusing on what can be proven. That shift is critical in cold cases. It is the moment when emotion begins to lose ground to structure. Then came the archival breakthrough. A storage facility audit uncovered a misfiled box of supplementary notes from early-stage interviews. These were not part of the official case file. They were handwritten field observations, some incomplete, some rushed, some never digitized. Most were redundant. But one entry changed the tone of everything. A single line, written by an investigator during the first week of the disappearance, noted a detail that had never been emphasized in official reports. A witness who appeared unusually calm when describing events near the victim's last known location. The note did not accuse. It did not conclude. It simply observed that the emotional response did not match the severity of the situation being described. At the time, it was dismissed as subjective interpretation. Now, it was being read differently. Because emotional inconsistency, when combined with timeline proximity and repeated presence in the record, begins to form a pattern investigators cannot ignore. Not proof, but pressure. And pressure, in cold cases, often leads to collapse somewhere down the line. For the first time in over 2 decades, the case was no longer moving outward into more questions. It was narrowing. Quietly. Relentlessly. Like a corridor slowly closing around a single unseen point at its center. And though no one inside the investigation yet said it aloud, the shape of that center was beginning to resemble something disturbingly human. The investigation had entered a phase where silence was no longer passive. It was active. Measured. Almost defensive. Every time a new analytical layer was added, new timelines, new forensic reprocessing, new behavioral modeling, the case didn't simply reveal answers. It resisted. Not in an obvious way, not through contradictions or dramatic dead ends, but through subtle instability, as if the truth itself had been conditioned to remain just out of reach. Detectives began noticing something unsettling about the structure of the entire file. It did not behave like a typical unsolved disappearance. Most cold cases degrade over time, witnesses forget, evidence decays, leads dissolve into ambiguity. But this one retained an unnatural clarity in certain segments, as if preserved deliberately, while other segments were erased so completely they left no friction at all. That imbalance became the new focus. Because investigators understand something crucial, real life rarely edits itself so cleanly. As the review intensified, attention shifted toward reconstruction of interpersonal connections surrounding the victim in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Not just friends, not just co-workers, but peripheral contacts, people who existed on the edges of daily life. Delivery routes. Routine interactions. Brief exchanges that normally vanish from memory within hours. What emerged was not a list of suspects. It was a map of proximity. And on that map, one presence began to appear with increasing frequency, not because they were central to any single event, but because they were consistently close to multiple unrelated points in the timeline. A kind of quiet repetition that, individually, meant nothing, but collectively suggested something harder to dismiss. Still, detectives resisted drawing conclusions. Cold cases punish assumptions. So instead, they built layers of verification. Digital analysts re-examined phone tower pings from archived records. The technology from 2000 was crude compared to modern standards, but still capable of revealing rough movement patterns. When plotted geographically, several devices, including those belonging to individuals previously considered peripheral, showed overlapping coverage zones during the critical time frame. Again, nothing definitive. But convergence began to appear where once there had been randomness. At the same time, forensic accountants revisited financial behavior associated with key individuals in the investigation radius. Most records were unremarkable. Normal spending. Normal withdrawals. Normal patterns of daily life. But one account displayed subtle anomalies, small, infrequent transactions that seemed unrelated to routine behavior, occurring around key investigative milestones in the original timeline. Not enough to suggest criminal activity. Not enough even to suggest coordination. But enough to raise a quiet question: why those moments? Why then? Why not others? Questions like that rarely provide answers directly. Instead, they guide investigators toward deeper layers of context, where intention sometimes reveals itself not through action, but through timing. Inside the department, tension began to build, not from urgency, but from accumulation. Every new piece of analysis reinforced the same underlying sensation: the case was no longer scattered. It was compressing. A senior investigator described it privately as gravity returning to the file. Everything, no matter how distant, seemed to be pulled toward a central point that no one could yet fully define. And then came the behavioral review update. A specialist in long-term case psychology was brought in to reassess interview patterns across all recorded statements. The goal was not to identify lies, but to identify consistency under time pressure. People who lie once often adjust their story. People who tell the truth rarely need correction. But people who construct narratives over time tend to show a different signature entirely: precision in certain areas, vagueness in others, and most importantly, stability that feels slightly unnatural. One subject's interview history began to stand out under this lens. Not because of contradiction, but because of endurance. The same emotional tone. The same phrasing patterns. The same restrained responses, even across years and different questioning contexts. It was as if the narrative had been stabilized early and never allowed to evolve organically. That observation alone would not have been enough to justify further action. But in cold cases, accumulation is everything. Around the same period, a new forensic review of physical evidence storage conditions revealed environmental inconsistencies in how certain items had been preserved in the early years of the investigation. Temperature fluctuations, humidity exposure, and relocation events had affected sample integrity in ways that were never fully documented at the time. One particular item, previously considered insignificant, had been stored under conditions that, according to modern standards, could have degraded trace evidence unevenly. This meant that earlier negative results might not have been fully reliable. So the sample was tested again. And again. And again. Each iteration refined the data slightly, reducing noise, increasing clarity. And while the results still did not produce a definitive match, it did something almost more important. It strengthened exclusion boundaries, narrowing the field of possible contributors further than ever before. Inside the investigation team, the emotional atmosphere shifted again. Not toward certainty, but toward inevitability. Because when a case repeatedly removes possibilities without providing answers, it begins to shape the outline of whatever remains. At this stage, detectives were no longer asking whether the truth would emerge. They were asking when the structure they were building would finally reveal what had been hidden inside it all along. And somewhere deep in the archived record, inside interview transcripts, timestamp logs, and years of carefully preserved silence, there was now a growing sense that the case was no longer a mystery scattered across time. It was becoming a singular point of convergence. One that had been waiting, unnoticed, for more than 20 years to finally be seen clearly. By the time the investigation reached its fifth phase of review, the case no longer felt like something being solved in the traditional sense. It felt like something being uncovered layer by layer, as if the truth had been buried not in a single moment, but across time itself, scattered deliberately across years of documentation, memory, and silence. The convergence investigators had been tracking was no longer theoretical. It was visible in structure, even if still invisible in identity. Timelines that once appeared unrelated now overlapped in ways too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Movement patterns, witness proximity, and archival inconsistencies were beginning to align along a narrowing corridor of probability. Still, no one inside the department used the word suspect. Not yet. Because cold cases teach caution the hard way. Premature certainty has destroyed more investigations than lack of evidence ever did. Instead, the focus shifted to verification under pressure, testing every remaining assumption against independent sources that had never been cross-contaminated by earlier investigative interpretations. That meant returning to the very beginning again, but with a different purpose, not to find what was missed, but to confirm what had survived scrutiny across 2 decades. And what survived was surprisingly small. But small does not mean insignificant. In fact, in long-term investigations, the smallest consistent elements often become the most revealing. One of those elements was presence. Not physical presence captured on camera or recorded in logs, but inferred presence, being close enough to intersect with multiple independent accounts, without ever becoming central to any of them. It is a pattern detectives often overlook in early stages, because it feels too ordinary to matter. But over time, ordinariness becomes suspicious when it repeats too precisely. As analysts reconstructed daily activity flows from the week of the disappearance, a pattern emerged involving several individuals whose movements intersected in geographically limited zones. The victim's last confirmed location, nearby transit routes, and surrounding residential and commercial areas formed a tight cluster of activity that evening. Within that cluster, one individual's recorded movements appeared consistently adjacent to multiple key points. Not inside them. Not excluded from them. But adjacent, repeatedly. Like a shadow that never quite steps into the light. Meanwhile, forensic psychologists refined earlier behavioral interpretations. They were not trying to define guilt, but to understand narrative stability under stress. The subject of interest, still unnamed in official discussion, had demonstrated something unusual across multiple interviews. A remarkable consistency in emotional delivery that did not degrade over time. Most people, when revisiting an event years later, unconsciously alter their tone. They add uncertainty. They correct themselves. They drift slightly in phrasing as memory softens. But in this case, the emotional structure remained rigid. Not dramatic. Not exaggerated. Controlled. Almost rehearsed. That observation did not accuse anyone of deception. But it did suggest construction, an internal framework that had been preserved with unusual discipline. At the same time, a breakthrough occurred in digital reconstruction efforts. Analysts used modern mapping software to simulate real-world movement possibilities based on known constraints from the year 2000, vehicle speed limits, road conditions, weather data, and recorded traffic patterns. The goal was to determine whether all known statements and timelines could coexist without contradiction. Most scenarios produced multiple viable paths. But one configuration did not. Under that configuration, certain movements became physically improbable unless specific timing assumptions were adjusted. And when those adjustments were applied, a new alignment emerged, one that reduced randomness significantly and concentrated opportunity windows into a much narrower time frame. That time frame aligned uncomfortably well with previously noted gaps in verified sightings. Still, even this was not enough. Not for legal action. Not for public statements. But it was enough to change how the case was perceived internally. Because once probability begins to concentrate, it stops being abstract. It becomes directional. And direction, in investigative work, always leads somewhere. Around this point, the department made a quiet but significant decision. They expanded the scope of re-interviews once again, but with a new strategy. Instead of asking open-ended questions, investigators focused on micro-consistencies, details that are difficult to maintain across time if they were not genuine. What time exactly did you arrive? Which direction did you come from? What was the first thing you noticed? Where were you standing when you made that observation? These questions, repeated across decades, often produce subtle drift in answers. But in carefully constructed narratives, they remain unnervingly stable. And in one set of responses, that stability persisted too precisely. Not enough to accuse, but enough to isolate. Meanwhile, forensic teams revisited environmental trace evidence again, focusing on contamination chains that had been poorly documented in the early 2000s. Advances in trace reconstruction allowed them to distinguish between primary and secondary transfer in ways that were previously impossible. This reclassification did not produce new evidence, but it recontextualized old evidence. Objects once considered irrelevant now had potential pathways of contact. And those pathways, when overlaid with reconstructed timelines, began to form intersections that were difficult to ignore. Inside the investigation unit, a quiet shift took place. Conversations became shorter. Notes became more precise. Hypotheses were no longer spoken aloud without supporting documentation nearby. Because everyone could feel the same pressure building. Not from external demand, but from internal structure. The case was no longer expanding. It was tightening. Like a lens slowly focusing on a single point that had always been there, just too blurred to recognize. And in that tightening, investigators began to sense something they had not felt in years. Not closure. Not resolution. But proximity. The feeling that whatever had happened in Minnesota in 2000 was no longer hidden in fragments scattered across time. It was now coalescing. And somewhere inside that coalescence, the truth, long silent, long patient, was preparing to surface in a way no one in the room was yet ready to fully confront. By now, the case had stopped behaving like an archive and started behaving like a system under pressure. Every new layer of analysis didn't just add information, it reduced freedom. Possibilities were collapsing inward, one by one, as if the investigation itself had begun to impose shape on something that had resisted definition for more than 20 years. Inside the department, no one spoke about luck anymore. There was only structure. And structure, once recognized, demands follow-through. The first real turning point came from a full remapping of interpersonal proximity data. Analysts rebuilt the social environment of the victim's final week using everything available: credit card timestamps, known phone contacts, workplace logs, vehicle sightings, and witness recollections that could be independently verified. The result was not dramatic at first glance. No sudden revelation. No single moment of clarity. Instead, it was a tightening web. And at the center of that web, again and again, was the same recurring point of contact: an individual who never dominated any single interaction, but who consistently appeared within the margins of multiple unrelated ones. A presence that never triggered attention at the time, but became increasingly difficult to explain away as coincidence once viewed in aggregate. Detectives began to refer to it internally in neutral terms: the overlap profile. Not a suspect. Not yet. Just a pattern. But patterns, when they survive long enough, start demanding interpretation. At the same time, forensic analysts completed a full reprocessing of all preserved trace evidence using updated contamination separation techniques. This was not simply retesting, it was recontextualization. Every sample was reclassified based on modern understanding of transfer pathways, environmental degradation, and storage bias. And for the first time, a faint but consistent thread emerged across multiple items that had previously been considered unrelated. Not enough to identify anyone directly. Not enough for a match. But enough to suggest that certain objects shared a common exposure environment during a critical window of time. That window aligned uncomfortably well with the narrow timeframe already identified through timeline reconstruction. Inside the investigation room, the atmosphere shifted again. Less speculation. More focus. Because once separate strands begin to converge on the same temporal point, investigators know they are no longer dealing with randomness. They are dealing with causality that has not yet been fully exposed. Then came the digital breakthrough. Archived law enforcement databases from the early 2000s were never designed for modern analytical depth. They were fragmented, inconsistent, and often stored in incompatible formats. But when migrated into a unified system and re-indexed using contemporary search architecture, they revealed something unexpected. A repeated pattern of access behavior. Not from the victim. Not from unrelated third parties. but from a small subset of individuals who had accessed case-related updates, reports, or internal summaries over a span of years far beyond what their official involvement would justify. One name appeared repeatedly across these access logs. Not prominently. Not suspiciously at first glance. But persistently. The same individual already present in multiple proximity reconstructions. The same individual already identified in overlapping movement simulations. The same individual already noted in behavioral consistency reviews. Now, for the first time, all independent analytical paths were pointing toward the same gravitational center. Still, detectives resisted naming it. Because naming something too early can distort everything that follows. Instead, they moved into controlled confirmation protocols. Recontacting witnesses again, but this time with carefully structured questions designed to test memory integrity under repeated recall conditions. Investigators were not looking for new stories. They were looking for deviation, small shifts in phrasing, hesitation patterns, and corrections that might indicate reconstruction rather than recollection. And slowly, something began to emerge. Certain statements that had remained stable for years began to fracture under precise questioning. Not in ways that suggested intentional deception in a straightforward sense, but in ways that suggested memory had been reinforced over time, rehearsed not necessarily to deceive others, but perhaps to preserve internal consistency. One witness, when asked to describe the same sequence of events for the third time in a controlled setting, paused longer than before. Their answer did not change dramatically, but the certainty behind it did. The language softened. The edges blurred. That softening mattered more than contradiction. Because certainty is often what collapses first when constructed narratives are pressed. Meanwhile, forensic reconstruction of mobile device data reached its most refined stage yet. Analysts simulated coverage zones using reconstructed tower models from the year 2000, adjusting for known infrastructure limitations and signal variability. When overlaid with the established timeline, a striking pattern emerged: multiple devices clustered within a confined geographic corridor during the critical disappearance window. And within that corridor, movement probabilities narrowed further. Until only a few viable paths remained. Paths that, when traced backward, consistently converged toward the same environmental zone, a rural stretch outside town that had been searched early in the investigation, but under conditions that would not meet modern forensic standards. That realization triggered a controlled re-examination order. Not a public search. Not a renewed operation. But a quiet, methodical return to ground zero with updated technology, updated assumptions, and zero tolerance for earlier blind spots. Teams returned to the area under controlled conditions. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed across sections previously dismissed as low probability. Soil sampling was conducted with refined stratification methods. Vegetation patterns were analyzed for long-term disturbance signatures. Most of the findings were inconclusive. But not all. One segment of land showed subtle, long-term soil disruption inconsistent with natural environmental activity. It was not definitive. It did not indicate anything as direct as remains or burial. But it did suggest that at some point, the ground in that location had been altered in a way that was not recorded, not explained, and not consistent with surrounding terrain behavior. For investigators, that was enough to justify escalation. Because cold cases rarely offer clarity all at once. They offer pressure points. And once enough pressure points are identified, the structure holding the mystery together begins to fail. Back at headquarters, the investigative lead reviewed everything again: proximity data, digital logs, forensic reanalysis, witness reevaluations, and the newly identified geographic anomaly. He did not speak for a long time after reading through the consolidated report. Then he said something that would later be remembered by those in the room. Not as a conclusion, but as a recognition. "We're not looking anymore," he said quietly. "We're closing in." And for the first time in over 2 decades, the case no longer felt like it was being studied from a distance. It felt close enough to touch. Still unseen, but no longer out of reach. The moment investigators step onto ground that has been touched by suspicion for years, everything changes. Not because the place itself transforms, but because perception does. What once looked like ordinary terrain begins to feel weighted, as if the landscape remembers something the people who walked it have tried to forget. The renewed field operation was carried out in near silence. No public attention. No press presence. Just a coordinated effort between forensic teams, mapping specialists, and a small group of investigators who had lived with this case long enough to recognize that it was no longer about searching. It was about confirming. Every step taken across that rural stretch felt measured, almost cautious, as though disturbance itself could disrupt something still resting beneath the surface of time. The ground had been searched before, years earlier, under conditions that now seemed almost primitive in comparison. Back then, teams relied on visual sweeps, cadaver dogs, and manual excavation in selected zones. It had been thorough by the standards of the time. It had also been incomplete by the standards of now. Technology had changed the rules. Ground-penetrating radar swept across the field in slow, overlapping passes. Drone imaging captured subtle variations in elevation and vegetation density. Soil composition was sampled at multiple depths with precision instruments designed to detect disturbance patterns invisible to the naked eye. At first, nothing stood out. Just earth. Just distance. Just the quiet persistence of time. Then, slowly, something began to emerge in the data. Not an object. Not a clear signature. But a disruption in layering, an inconsistency in soil compaction that did not match natural formation processes. It was faint, almost dismissible in isolation. But when mapped across multiple scan lines, the inconsistency formed a shape. Not large. Not obvious. But deliberate enough to draw attention. Inside the command vehicle, analysts replayed the scan repeatedly, adjusting filters, recalibrating depth parameters, and comparing it against environmental baselines. Each iteration removed noise. Each pass sharpened the anomaly. No one spoke immediately after the confirmation threshold was crossed. Because experienced investigators understand something important, anomalies are not answers. They are invitations to look closer. A controlled excavation was authorized. Carefully. Methodically. Without haste. As the top layer of soil was removed, the atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. The kind of shift that occurs when expectation begins to collide with possibility. Every shovel pass, every measured extraction, was documented and preserved. Still, nothing definitive appeared. Just layers of earth that had settled naturally over years of weather, season, and time. But beneath those layers, something interrupted the continuity. A zone of soil that behaved differently under pressure. Denser. Slightly altered in composition. Not enough to declare anything outright, but enough to signal that this location had been disturbed in a way that did not match surrounding areas. The excavation paused. Not out of hesitation, but out of procedure. Additional forensic specialists were called in. Photogrammetry teams documented every angle. Environmental scientists reviewed the soil profiles. The goal was no longer discovery, it was validation. And validation in cold case work must survive scrutiny from every discipline. As analysis continued, attention returned once again to the convergence profile that had been forming across all investigative streams. The same individual, already present in proximity maps, already appearing in behavioral analyses, already noted in digital access patterns, now existed within a growing framework that no longer depended on any single piece of evidence. It was no longer about one inconsistency. It was about accumulation. Every system, digital, physical, behavioral, geographical, was beginning to align toward the same narrow corridor of probability. Still, investigators held back from formal accusation. Because alignment is not yet proof. And proof is the only currency that matters in a courtroom. Meanwhile, a second layer of forensic reanalysis focused on temporal reconstruction accuracy. Analysts refined the timeline further, incorporating weather data from archived meteorological records. Snowfall timing. Temperature fluctuations. Ground freeze-thaw cycles. These details mattered because they affected movement, visibility, and the preservation or degradation of physical traces. When integrated into the existing model, the revised timeline produced something unexpected. It reduced uncertainty windows even further. And in doing so, it tightened the operational space of the disappearance to a period so narrow it began to feel almost surgical in its precision. Within that narrowed window, investigators re-examined all known activities once again. Not to find new events, but to confirm overlap consistency. And with each pass, the same pattern reappeared, a small cluster of movements, interactions, and sightings that all converged within the same geographic radius. The radius surrounding the excavation site. At headquarters, the investigative team reviewed the findings in silence for several minutes before anyone spoke. The lead investigator finally broke it with a single observation that carried more weight than any formal conclusion. "It keeps pointing back here," he said. "Not as speculation. As recognition. Because in complex cold cases, repetition is never random. Repetition is structure attempting to reveal itself." Outside, the excavation continued at reduced pace, each layer removed treated as a potential boundary between known history and unknown truth. Every soil sample was bagged. Every measurement recorded. Every anomaly preserved. No one yet knew what would be found beneath the final threshold. But the investigation had already crossed an invisible line. The point where uncertainty begins to collapse into focus. And as the team worked under the quiet gray sky, there was a growing awareness that whatever lay beneath that ground was no longer just evidence. It was the final missing connection in a system that had been building for over 20 years. And once that connection was confirmed, there would be no returning to ambiguity. Only answers. The excavation site no longer felt like a search area. It felt like a threshold. Every layer of soil removed carried the weight of 2 decades of uncertainty, as if the ground itself had been holding on to something it was finally being forced to release. The work continued under strict control, measured and deliberate, with no room for interpretation or assumption. Every movement was documented, every sample preserved, every change in soil texture analyzed in real time. What made this phase different was not just the technology being used, but the absence of randomness in what they were finding. Even when results were inconclusive, they were inconclusive in the same direction, toward disturbance, toward interruption, toward a moment in time that had left a lasting imprint beneath the surface. At this stage, investigators were no longer asking if something had happened here. They were trying to understand how deeply it had changed the ground. The soil profile became increasingly complex as the excavation progressed. Layers that should have followed natural sedimentation patterns instead showed subtle inconsistencies in density and composition. Some sections were slightly compressed, others slightly loosened, as if pressure had been applied unevenly across the area at a specific point in the past. Forensic geologists noted that these patterns were not random environmental artifacts. They were consistent with a localized disruption event, something that had altered the terrain in a way that persisted even after years of natural recovery. Still, nothing definitive emerged. No clear physical evidence. No immediate sign of remains or identifiable material. Just structure. Disturbance without clarity. And in cold cases, that is often the most psychologically difficult stage, the moment when data suggests significance, but refuses to define it. Inside the command unit, analysts cross-referenced excavation coordinates with reconstructed movement maps once again. When overlaid, the correlation tightened further. The zone of soil disturbance aligned almost perfectly with a convergence point identified through multiple independent analytical systems, proximity data, mobile tower reconstruction, and behavioral timeline modeling. Individually, each system had limitations. Together, they formed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The investigative lead reviewed the updated report without speaking for several minutes. The room remained quiet except for the sound of equipment logs updating in real time. When he finally did speak, his tone was lower than before. "We're not guessing anymore," he said. "We're narrowing the last unknowns." That phrase carried a different meaning now. Because narrowing unknowns in a cold case does not create comfort. It creates proximity to consequence. Meanwhile, forensic teams shifted focus from broad excavation to micro-level soil analysis. Instead of searching for large-scale evidence, they began isolating fine particulate differences within the disturbed zone. Mineral composition, organic residue breakdown, moisture retention anomalies, all were examined under high-resolution scanning techniques. And slowly, something subtle emerged. Not an object. Not a definitive trace. But a chemical deviation pattern inconsistent with surrounding soil strata. It was faint, but persistent across multiple sample points within the same localized area. This suggested that at some point in the past, an external factor had altered the soil chemistry in a contained region, leaving behind a lingering signature. It was not enough to identify cause. But it was enough to confirm interruption. Back at headquarters, attention shifted again to the convergence profile that had been building across all investigative streams. By now, it was no longer a theoretical model. It was a layered structure supported by independent systems that had all begun to align without coordination. The same individual remained present across multiple layers. Proximity reconstruction. Digital access history. Behavioral consistency analysis. Witness proximity mapping. And now indirect correlation with the excavation zone. None of these elements alone were sufficient for legal action. But together, they formed something investigators rarely encounter outside of courtroom conclusions. A converging probability structure that pointed toward a single focal point. Still, no arrest was made. Because even converging probability must eventually be anchored in admissible evidence. And that evidence had not yet fully surfaced. The excavation continued. Deeper now. Slower. More controlled. At certain points, work paused entirely to allow environmental stabilization and prevent contamination of deeper layers. Each pause added tension, not relief. Because pauses in this kind of investigation are never empty, they are moments where expectation builds pressure against what has not yet been revealed. And beneath that pressure, something finally began to change. A shift in soil consistency that was more pronounced than anything previously observed. Not dramatic. Not sudden. But distinct enough that every specialist on site immediately recognized it as significant. The layer below behaved differently. It resisted separation in a way that surrounding soil did not. It held form longer than expected. And when sampled, it produced irregular structural fragmentation patterns inconsistent with natural deposition. The command team was notified immediately. Operations slowed further. Documentation intensified. Every movement became deliberate, as if the act of continuing itself required acknowledgement of what might be beneath. And yet, even with all this progression, no one spoke the word they were beginning to think. Because in investigations like this, naming something too early can distort judgment. So they waited. Measured. Observed. As the excavation reached the next threshold layer, the atmosphere changed again, subtly, but unmistakably. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Movements became quieter. Even the machinery seemed to operate under reduced intensity, as though the environment itself had begun to absorb attention. What lay beneath this point was no longer just a possibility. It was becoming an expectation. And expectations in cold cases are dangerous, because they always demand resolution. But resolution, when it finally arrives, rarely resembles what anyone has prepared for. At this depth, the excavation was no longer about procedure. It was about restraint. Every centimeter of soil removed carried the same question: what happens when the case finally stops resisting? Because by now, the resistance had changed form. It was no longer about missing information or unclear timelines. It was about proximity, how close investigators were willing to get before the unknown stopped behaving like data and started behaving like consequence. The next layer revealed a shift that no one on site needed to be told twice. It was immediate. Not visually dramatic, but structurally undeniable. The soil composition changed again, this time in a way that suggested interruption far more recent than the surrounding stratification would normally allow. The consistency was irregular, as if the ground had been disturbed and then artificially stabilized before natural processes could fully restore it. Forensic geologists paused all active excavation in the immediate zone. Samples were taken again, this time with extreme precision, isolating microlayers that could indicate sequencing of disturbance. When analyzed, the results did not provide a clear narrative, but they did provide directionality. The disturbance was not random. It followed a contained boundary, suggesting that whatever had occurred had been limited to a specific physical space. That realization changed the tone of the entire operation. Because contained disturbance implies control. And control implies intention. Inside the command unit, analysts updated the convergence model in real time. Every new data point from the excavation was being layered into existing reconstructions, movement probability maps, digital access records, and behavioral consistency profiles. With each update, the model did not expand outward. It contracted inward. Tighter. More focused. More specific. Until the system began to resemble something no longer distributed across time, but anchored to a single unresolved event window. The lead investigator studied the model in silence. There was no excitement in his expression. Only recognition of something that had been slowly forming for years without permission. "We're not circling anymore," he said quietly. "We're inside it." No one responded, because there was nothing to add. Outside, excavation resumed at a slower pace, now treated less like search and more like controlled exposure. Every movement of soil was documented with forensic-grade imaging. Soil layers were peeled back in thin sections, almost surgical in precision, as if the ground itself had become evidence rather than terrain. Then came the change. A section of soil behaved differently under excavation pressure, breaking away not in loose fragments, but in compacted segments that held shape longer than expected. Within those segments, subtle anomalies appeared, variations in density, irregular compression patterns, and traces of material that did not match the surrounding environmental profile. The team halted again. This time, the pause was longer. Not due to uncertainty, but due to protocol escalation. Specialized forensic anthropologists were called in. Additional imaging was conducted. The zone was rescanned using high-resolution, ground-penetrating systems calibrated for low-depth anomaly detection. And beneath the next layer, something began to emerge that shifted the investigation from inference to anticipation. Not confirmation. Not yet. But proximity to something that could no longer be explained away as environmental variance. Inside headquarters, communication between field and analysts became more compressed. Messages were shorter. Updates were more frequent. The language of the investigation had changed, no longer exploratory, but directional. Every system now pointed toward the same confined space beneath the excavation site. Still, the team did not rush. Because in cold case work, speed is how mistakes happen. And mistakes in moments like this can erase the very thing everyone has spent decades trying to preserve. Then, without warning, the excavation encountered a boundary that felt different from everything above it. The soil no longer behaved like layered earth. It behaved like a transition zone. Compact. Unyielding. And uneven in a way that suggested disruption beyond natural geological formation. A forensic specialist described it simply, without dramatization. "This is not normal deposition," he said. "Something changed the structure here." That statement did not accuse anything. But it narrowed interpretation significantly. Because in investigative science, when natural explanation weakens, alternative explanation gains weight. And at this point, alternative explanations were no longer abstract. They were becoming necessary. As the team carefully continued, attention inside headquarters shifted back to the convergence profile once more. The system had now reached a stage where independent analytical models, each built using different methodologies, were producing overlapping results with increasing consistency. Proximity modeling. Behavioral analysis. Digital trace reconstruction. Forensic environmental mapping. All converging toward a single spatial-temporal intersection. And that intersection was now directly beneath the excavation zone. The realization did not create celebration. It created silence. Because silence is what follows when investigators understand they are no longer exploring uncertainty, they are approaching resolution. But resolution, even when expected, is never emotionally neutral. It carries weight. And in this case, that weight had been building for 20 years. As the excavation reached its deepest confirmed layer so far, operations slowed to near stillness. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, almost reverent in its precision. It was no longer about what might be found. It was about what had always been there, waiting beneath every assumption made since the winter of 2000. And now, finally, the ground was beginning to give up its resistance. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But in a way that suggested the truth was no longer holding itself back. It was coming closer to being seen. There are moments in an investigation where the world outside the perimeter feels unreal, as if it has been muted to make room for what is about to be revealed. Traffic continues somewhere beyond the fields. Weather shifts. Time moves forward. But inside the controlled zone, everything slows into a kind of suspended attention, each second stretched thin by expectation. At this stage, the excavation was no longer exploratory. It was confirmatory. Every decision had already been made upstream. What remained was the physical act of revealing what the data had been insisting on for days, 4 weeks, 4 years, depending on which layer of analysis you trusted. The final barrier layer gave way differently than the ones above it. Not softer. Not harder. But inconsistent in a way that immediately drew full attention from the forensic team. Sections of compacted earth separated unevenly, as if the structure had been disturbed and then partially stabilized under pressure that was not naturally occurring. The moment it happened, operations stopped again. No one spoke. Not because there was confusion, but because recognition was beginning to form without permission. Forensic specialists moved in with heightened protocol. High-resolution imaging devices were lowered carefully into the exposed section. Soil was removed in thin, controlled increments, each layer documented before the next was disturbed. And then, the system began to change. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But irreversibly. A material boundary appeared within the soil profile, something that did not match surrounding composition. It was not yet identifiable at first glance, but it disrupted the natural continuity of the ground in a way that could not be dismissed as geological anomaly. The lead forensic geologist paused for several seconds before speaking. "Hold excavation," he said quietly. "We need full documentation on this layer." The command echoed through the site like a final checkpoint being acknowledged. Every camera angle was adjusted. Every instrument recalibrated. Every movement slowed further. Inside headquarters, analysts watching the live feed stopped updating models for the first time in hours. The convergence map, which had been tightening steadily for days, now showed no further room for contraction. Everything had aligned. Spatial, temporal, behavioral, environmental. All of it converging on the same point. And now that point was visible. Back in the field, the excavation resumed with extreme precision. Soil was cleared in fragments so small they seemed almost insignificant. But each fragment mattered. Each one carried the possibility of shifting the entire interpretation of the site. Then came the shift that changed the entire atmosphere. A distinct structural irregularity was exposed beneath the soil line, something that did not belong to the natural environment. It was not yet fully visible, but its presence was unmistakable to trained eyes. The team froze again. This time, no one needed instruction. Protocol took over automatically. The area was secured. The perimeter tightened. Specialists were called forward. The air itself seemed heavier, not because anything had changed physically, but because anticipation had reached its peak threshold. For more than 20 years, this case had existed as absence. Absence of answers. Absence of resolution. Absence of certainty. And now, for the first time, absence was being replaced by form. Slowly. Reluctantly. But undeniably. As the next layer was carefully cleared, the object beneath became partially visible. Not fully exposed. Not yet identified in absolute terms. But enough of its structure was revealed to shift interpretation from possibility to confrontation with reality. Inside headquarters, the analyst overseeing the convergence model simply leaned back from the screen. No announcement was made. No dramatic reaction followed. Instead, there was a collective understanding that something had transitioned beyond analytical reconstruction. It had entered physical confirmation space. The lead investigator received the update through a secure channel. He read it once. Then again. There was no immediate response. Only a long pause, as if acknowledging that every path the investigation had taken for 2 decades had been leading toward this singular moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled. "Secure the site," he said. "No further exposure until full forensic sweep is complete." The instruction was not about urgency. It was about preservation. Because whatever lay beneath that soil was no longer just evidence. It was the center of everything that had remained unresolved since the year 2000. Outside, the wind moved across the field again, as if nothing had changed. But inside the perimeter, time no longer felt continuous. It felt segmented, before this moment, and everything that would follow it. As forensic teams prepared for full analysis, one reality settled quietly across every participant on site. The investigation had reached the point where it could no longer be reversed. Only completed. And somewhere beneath the controlled excavation zone, the final missing piece of a 20-year silence was about to be fully brought into the light. The site was no longer treated like an excavation. It was treated like a perimeter of consequence. Every movement had weight now. Not because of danger in the traditional sense, but because of what exposure meant. After 2 decades of uncertainty, the investigation had crossed into a stage where every additional centimeter of visibility could reshape everything that had been assumed, recorded, and reconstructed since the winter of 2000. Specialized forensic teams arrived under controlled conditions. No external communication was allowed. Equipment was recalibrated on site to ensure that no detail of what lay beneath would be misinterpreted, misclassified, or lost to contamination during extraction. Even the air around the zone felt regulated, measured in behavior if not in physics. What had once been a search had now become documentation of a truth that refused to remain abstract. The partially exposed structure beneath the soil was now clearly defined as something man-made or deliberately placed, though its exact form was still obscured by remaining layers of compacted earth. Every new removal revealed more of its boundary, but never all at once. It resisted full disclosure in a way that made the process feel almost ceremonial. Each stage required confirmation from multiple specialists before continuing. No assumptions. No acceleration. Only verification. Inside headquarters, the convergence model had reached its final state. There were no further variables to adjust, no additional probability pathways to explore. Every analytical system had collapsed into a single point of alignment, and that point now corresponded precisely with the location being excavated in real time. The analyst responsible for maintaining the model simply kept the display open without interaction. There was nothing left to calculate. The system was no longer predictive, it was descriptive. It was no longer forecasting an outcome. It was reflecting one that was already unfolding. In the field, the excavation continued. Carefully. Quietly. With the kind of precision that only exists when every participant understands that they are no longer searching for information, they are revealing it. And then, finally, the structure beneath the soil reached a point where its identity could no longer remain ambiguous. It was not a natural formation. It was not a geological anomaly. It was something that had been placed, sealed, and left undisturbed for a very long time. The moment this became clear, operations paused again. Not out of uncertainty, but out of protocol and respect for process. A full forensic documentation sweep was initiated. High-resolution imaging captured every exposed surface. Environmental readings were taken to ensure no contamination or external interference would compromise interpretation. Specialists rotated in and out of the zone to prevent fatigue from influencing judgment. Because everyone understood what this stage meant. This was no longer about finding evidence. This was about confirming history. The lead investigator arrived at the site in person shortly after the update. He did not approach immediately. Instead, he stood at the perimeter for a long moment, observing the controlled activity in silence. Those who had worked with him long enough recognized the expression on his face, not shock, not surprise, but something closer to resolution under restraint. When he finally entered the command area, he reviewed the live documentation feeds without speaking. Frame by frame, layer by layer, he absorbed what had been uncovered. No one interrupted him. There was no need. After several minutes, he gave a single instruction. Continue exposure, he said. Slow and complete. Back in the excavation zone, the process resumed. The final layers of soil were removed with extreme care, revealing more of the structure beneath. Its boundaries became clearer. Its shape more defined. Its presence no longer theoretical in any sense. And yet, even as visibility increased, identification remained deliberately controlled. Every exposed section was treated as part of a larger forensic narrative that had to be preserved intact for analysis. At one point, a specialist paused mid-procedure, holding position until another team member verified a measurement. The coordination was almost silent, almost instinctive, as if everyone involved had synchronized into a shared understanding of what must not be rushed. Then came the moment that changed the tone entirely. A distinct confirmation point was reached: enough exposure, enough structural visibility, enough contextual alignment that the object beneath the soil could no longer be interpreted as anything other than a central piece of the original disappearance event. The site did not erupt in reaction. There were no sudden movements. No verbal declarations. Instead, there was stillness. A collective stillness that followed realization rather than preceding it. Inside headquarters, the analyst finally closed the convergence model display.